For my third year of university, I was planning on moving into a large 4-bedroom house with the 3 girls I lived with during second year. We've gotten quite close over the previous 2 years, and I was more than happy to spend my third and final year with them. But in the last few weeks before summer break, I spotted a sign in the window of the house. So my way back from uni, and not just any old house either, this house was on my regular route back from university, meaning that I'd walked past it 100 times over the previous 8 months or so. And if I'm perfectly honest, I was obsessed with it. It sat on the elbow on a crooked street that was mostly terraced houses, and it stood out not only because it was detached, but because it has this cozy cottage vibe that appeared refreshingly out of place. It was the kind of house that I could see myself growing into a crazy old cat lady, and I can assure you, I mean that in the best possible sense. They had a tiny little garden out front, and from the looks of things, an outdoor cat who wouldn't let me pet her whenever she was sitting on the wall outside. All in all, it added up to my dream home. So imagine my excitement when I see a room for let sign in the window. I made a note of the email address printed on the small homemade sign and then practically ran back home to write up a first draft. Oh, and I mean, first draft, the email said to send over a phone number and a brief introduction, but I think I must have hit about 600 words before I realized that it was getting out of hand. I definitely went overboard in terms of hyping myself up and heaping praise on their own. But I wanted to live there so badly. And when the couple who owned the home got back to me, I wanted to do even more. They were a lovely husband and wife couple named Jen and Andrew. And the rent that they were asking for was about half what the other landlord wanted for our 4-bedroom place. I wouldn't even have to feel bad about backing out of my flatmate, says we'd had a mutual friend to jump at the chance to live with them. Once we had all the things hashed out, I moved in as soon as the lease on my old place ran out. And so began about 2 to 3 weeks of just absolute bliss. Jen and Andrew were a hard-working professional and outgoing couple, meaning I sometimes had the entire house to myself for 13 or 14 hours at a time. That kind of peaceful environment was exactly what I needed for my third and final year of study. And the whole place was decorated so nicely that moving in amounted to a dream come true. I was technically living in their future child's bedroom up in their attic conversion, but they left the decor very neutral, which, again, was exactly what I needed for long periods of focused study. I still lead a fairly active social life. But whereas my old flatmate's place became the party house during the weekend, I had this consistent crib of comfort to come home to whenever I needed some peace and tranquility. It was every student's dream in a way, and at the time, I thought that I was luckiest girl in the world. But if I'd have known what a slow drip nightmare that I'd just gotten myself into by moving in, I wouldn't have felt nearly so fortunate. Like I said, living there for the first 6 weeks or so was a dream. I was given my privacy and treated very respectfully, which I suppose is what made the sudden but subtle change easier to notice. One day, I came home from university and the porch door was closed. Now I always close the porch on my way out. Always out of respect for Jen and Andrew. I wanted to keep the heat and save them a few quid on bills. However, on that morning, I slept through my alarm. To get to my first morning lecture, I had to just throw in some clothes, rely on a hat to hide my bed head, and rush out of the house with just a few dabs of roll-on deodorant and some chewing gum to give the appearance of hygiene. Not my finest hour, but such is life as a student. I knew for a fact that I didn't close the porch door that morning, possibly for the first time since I've been living there. But like I said, when I got back to the house, it was closed. Later that day, I remarked to Jen and Andrew had dinner that one of them had been home that day, and both denied it. I wasn't confrontational or snarky about it, but I told them someone must have been home because the porch door didn't open. Both shrugged off, told me that no one else had a key, and assured me in the nicest possible way that I must have been mistaken. I was so sure that I wasn't. I mean 99.9% certain, because if I'd have closed it shut at the speed that I was going, I swear that I'd have shattered one of the door's panes of glass. But then if neither Jen nor Andrew said that they'd been home, there were no signs of forced entry or burglary. The Mamie was nothing to worry about. Don't get me wrong, I knew for certain someone had been home, I didn't feel that I was going mad or anything. I just didn't see it for the red flag that was not until it was too late. The point where I properly realized that Andrew wasn't quite the sweet married man that I thought he was the running I had with him outside the upstairs bathroom. I'll do the good courtesy of not getting into the nitty-gritty of what I was doing in there. But I was in there for a good few minutes. When I finish up, I wash and dry my hands, and then when I opened up the bathroom door, there's Andrew, standing right in front of me. It wasn't leering at me or anything. He was just smiling. I gave him an awkward greeting, expecting him to move out of my way. But he didn't. He just let a few more awkward seconds tick by before saying, "Sorry, I was just waiting for you to finish." I told him it was fine. Even though it bloody well wasn't, then he finally stepped out of my way and let me pass. God knows how long that he was standing out there just listening to me or whatever. We generally operate today. If the bathroom door's closed, it's in use policy to, so I know something wasn't right about him to standing out there silently. That was a really rough night, if I'm being honest. I thought I'd found my dream setup for my final year, and I thought Andrew was this wholesome, dedicated husband who wouldn't dream of making me uncomfortable. It wasn't a complete disaster if he turned out to be a bit of a creep. But it was just really disappointing, I suppose. Andrew went back to his best behavior for about a week after that. But just as I was starting to think that the whole bathroom thing had been a hideous misunderstanding, things escalated considerably. One night at about 3 in the morning, I get a phone call from one of my old flatmates. She was out drinking. There had been an incident with a boy, and she was both very drunk and very upset. I stayed up to talk to her for a few minutes, made sure that she was in a taxi on her way home, and then told her that I'd call her again in the morning. After that, I hung up and realized that I needed to nip to the toilet before heading back to bed. I rolled out of bed, put my very fluffy robe on, then crept towards my bedroom door to open it, only to find that it was already open. I always close my door at night, always, especially after the whole bathroom run-in, when I started to feel like Andrew's interest in me was less than wholesome. But then that night, my door was ever so slightly ajar. My heart started to pound as I realized someone had been watching me sleep. And me rolling over to answer my friend's call it then the thing to scare them off. If I'd stayed asleep, I imagined that they'd have just quietly closed my door again. But since I was awake, the sound of it suddenly closing would have most definitely alerted me to the presence. That whole thought chain that went through my head and a mile a minute, and suddenly, I didn't feel so much like going for a week anymore. The darkness in the hallway outside terrified me. So I just closed my door, got back into bed, and tried my best to go back to sleep. I woke up tired, anxious, and burst into pee, and my morning didn't get much better. After that, I met up with a friend that I told you about, the one having boy trouble, and I got about 5 minutes into a conversation with her before I just broke. I tried my best to hold back the tears with us being in public and all, but it was so hard. I was heartbroken, exhausted. I didn't even want to go back to the place I had once been head over heels in love with. Now I know this might sound like a major first word problem to some people. Oh, a man made me feel uncomfortable. What was me but look at it from my perspective? There was a progression to it, this sort of slow escalation. And if I didn't do something about it, it was bound to get worse. I ended up talking the whole thing out with her over a few cups of tea back at her place, and we hashed out a sort of plan. If I really loved that place as much as I said it's, and I didn't want to let Andrew's creepy behavior force me out, I had to get a lock on my door. Jen and Andrew hadn't thought to have one fitted, and I had a feeling that asking for one might get a bit awkward. But if I wanted to be safe while staying there, I needed to ask about one. I can also hear you practically screaming at your devices saying, "Why didn't you move out as soon as you realize you are in danger?" Well, I didn't actually think that I was in any actual danger. Having my privacy invaded, yes, in a big way. But did I think that there was a serious threat to my life? Not really. I wouldn't be seeing Andrew in quite the same light again. But I knew all I needed to do was get a lock and potentially warn Jen about her husband's behavior, and that might well resolve the issue. There's also the third factor that has kept me from just packing up on my stuff and just getting the bloody hell out of there. If I was a first year with time to play with, and yeah, maybe I had done just that. But this was my third year, the most crucial of my degrees. So couch surfing and looking for a new place would eat into my study time, ruined my focus, and potentially jeopardize my whole degree. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I weighed up my options, and I decided that staying at the cottage would be my best bet. When I raised the prospect of a lock on my door with Jen, it was just as awkward as I imagined, but also the most British kind of awkward imaginable. I caught her on a weekend, asked her very politely, and she said, yes, right away, actually thought the awkwardness was averted. But as I was walking away, Jen was like, is everything okay? I just didn't know how to address the issue there. And then knowing that it amounted to accusing her husband of slowly escalating harassment. So I didn't. I just said, yes, everything was fine. It's just that the whole lock thing had been on my mind for a while, and I wanted to ask if it was okay. It was obviously going to be their kids' room at some point. So a lock wouldn't be needed. But she agreed that they could simply remove it when the time came. I told her everything was okay. But I know that she didn't believe me, not 100%. Anyways, if I trusted them completely, if nothing was happening to make me feel uncomfortable, then I wouldn't be asking for one. And she knew that as well as I did. I was actually a bit worried that she just asked Andrew to do it, in which case, he knew that I tried to go behind his back with my request. But she didn't. She said that she'd get a handyman to do it. Since she and Andrew were both so busy with work. Now a few days go by, and I hear nothing back about the lock. And then after a week, I decided to give Jen a nudge about it. She apologized, told me that it completely slipped her mind, and promised to get on it as soon as possible. But that didn't do anything for me. Not really, because the same pattern and behavior was due to repeat itself. And in case you hadn't noticed, Andrew would do something, or something weird would happen with my room or belongings. And then he'd back off for a little while as if his compulsion was satisfied. Around the time I reminded Jen about the lock, Andrew had been quiet for a while. And since I was doing incident, I decided to employ one of the tactics my friend and I had talked about. We thrown around the idea of getting like a little miniature camera, a nanny cam, as they're called sometimes, as a way of catching Andrew in the act. A piece of tech like that was way beyond my very humble student budget. But then we realized that I already had a piece of surveillance equipment, or rather, something which would be easily made as a sort of ad hoc surveillance device, my laptop. I just had to keep it open and facing the door, maybe with a sort of sleep mode, a black screen app to make it look switched off, and then just record a very long video using Windows Movie Maker. Something had to take up a lot of memory. And the picture might not be the best. But it was a solid enough plan to be put into action. And so that's what I did. Day after day, night after night, I secretly recorded my room whenever I was out or asleep. I hadn't really considered how much work it was going to be sifting through video files that were anything from 7 to 10 hours long. And if it was what I needed to do before the lock was fitted, so be it. I was definitely ready to move out at that stage. Watching all that video was eating into my study time. But I know this might sound so lovey or naive. I felt a responsibility to Jen now. Her husband wasn't who she thought he was. And I just packed up and left her with him without even so much as a warning. What kind of person would that make me? I remember getting a text from her at the start of the week telling me that a handyman would be out on the Thursday to fit the lock. It was such a huge relief, but I also recommend that I keep on secretly filming until then. And as much as I wanted to say that I'm glad that I kept it up, I don't think that I can mean it wholeheartedly. On the Wednesday, the day before the handyman was due to fit the lock, I arrived back from uni and got to a time skipping through my ad hoc CCTV footage. I was so used to seeing absolutely nothing then when I skipped a one-time marker and saw a figure in my room. I honestly recoiled a little bit and fright. It was, you guessed it, Andrew. I'd had a bloody good idea that he'd been sneaking around my room, but to actually see it happening right there, in front of me. I felt this kind of skin crawl and nausea, the likes of which I'd never felt before. At first, he just stood there, careful not to touch anything, just sort of looking around, and I'm not claiming to be a psychic or anything, but it was like I could hear his thoughts. He'd obviously been told about the handyman fitting the lock, even if it was very late and in passing, and he wanted to make the most of his one final chance to snoop around my room before I had it under lock and key. He made it way over to this cork board that I had hanging from the one wall. Over the previous 2 years, I'd filled it with all kinds of pictures of me and my friends from uni, friends from back in Shrewsbury, pronouncing Polaroids and passport-sized pictures, a chaotic collage of memories and friends, both old and new. Andrew crept up to it, looked at it for a few minutes, and then reached up to pluck one of the smaller passport-sized pictures from one overpopulated corner. I was furious, extremely creeped out, but absolutely livid to only Andrew wasn't done yet. Photo in hand, he walked over to my bed and laid on it. Not on his back, but in a kind of rough fetal position, facing away from the camera. He stayed there long enough for me to think that he was sleeping, but then I saw him move. It was gentle at first, barely could see it at all. Until you could quite clearly see him shaking, almost like he was sobbing. But I don't even know how to say this. More sustained, maybe I couldn't work out exactly what he's doing. But he stayed like that for a few minutes. I know what you're thinking, what if he was doing that? And he certainly didn't leave any trace of it. When he finished, he just got up, straightened out my sheets, and then left with a stolen picture. I finally had them on camera, sneaking around my room, acting like a lunatic and stealing my things. Not exactly crime of the century or anything. But now I could quite literally show Jen, the kind of guy her husband really was. Granted, doing so would be quite an intrusive act that might well destroy their marriage. But women have got to look out for each other, right? At least, that's what that was taught growing up. I didn't really dilly-dally over it. I didn't let my new door lock put me off finally doing the right thing either. I waited until we could sit down together and have a proper chat, and then broke it to her as gently as possible. As I imagined, she was initially quite offended, and such an accusation. But we'd known each other for months by this point. And she knew that I wouldn't make up some wild claim out of hand. Naturally, she wanted to see the evidence just to know for certain that what I was saying was true. And when she watched the video clip by it isolated exactly for her, I could see that she turned pale. And when the clip was over, and Jenny apologized profusely to me, told me that she'd make things right, and then declared very grimly, I might add, I think I've got a phone call to make. I knew that they'd been some of the most difficult phone calls of her life. So I went for a walk to give her a bit of privacy. And when I got back, she caught me in the hallway. And tears were still streaking down her face, and told me Andrew was going to find somewhere else to live for a while. I cried a bit too as I gave her a hug. I kind of felt like her little sister, you know, and for the next week or so, I tried to be there for as best I could. But ultimately Jen just wanted to be alone. Just over a week later, I came home from university to find that Jen was home early. She said that she'd taken a mental health day at work and that come home at lunchtime to put the Christmas decorations up. But when she got back, she didn't really much feel like decorating. I asked if she'd spoken to Andrew and she had, but she didn't want to talk about it. She said that she couldn't really think about it without breaking down into tears. And there had been enough drama dumping on me for the time being. I told her that I'd be up in my room, but she needed me for anything, even if it was just to talk. And she thanked me, and I walked out into the hallway and up the stairs. I'd only been up in my room for a few minutes when my phone started to buzz. And it was a text from Jen saying a cup of tea with a question mark. We take into communicating like that, sometimes very first world of us, I know, but it saved her walking up the 2 flights of stairs. I text her back saying love on, and then got down to studying like I used to before all the horribleness had started. A few minutes later, Jen showed up with my tea, and then I got back to studying. Maybe 35 to 40 minutes later, I started to feel tired. Not just that usual later afternoon sluggishness either, I mean really lethargic, and drank the rest of the tea in gulps, hoping the little caffeine boost would see me through until the evening, but then just minutes later, I felt the exhaustion hit me like a brick wall. And I could barely keep my eyes open. I kept a few blister packs of Pro Plus, my desk drawer little caffeine pills that I used to take to pull all-nighters. And as I'm rummaging around looking for them, as knock on my door, it was Jen, wanting to know if I was feeling okay. She never came to my room like that. And there was something in the way that she looked to me that just seemed really out of character. It was like there was a question behind the question. And in a sudden moment of absolute horror, I realized what that question was. I tried to seem as awake as possible and told her that I was actually thinking about going out with a few friends of mine for a bit. She forced a smile and then just sort of left me there alone. I dry swallowed about 4 of those caffeine pills and then called the friend who had the boy trouble from earlier that I mentioned. And I just said something like, "I think they drugged me, please come and pick me up, call an ambulance." If I stopped texting back. I couldn't believe that I was texting someone those actual words. I even thought maybe I was being kind of paranoid. Never in a million years when I first moved in did I think that it eventually come to something like that, texting out an SOS, scared for my life, been completely and utterly betrayed by the one person I thought that he could trust. It was, and still remains, the worst night of my life. I made myself throw up to try and get whatever was left to that tainted tea out of me. But my friend still drove me to the A&E when she arrived to pick me up. I was kept in hospital overnight, and the nurses monitored my condition. But whatever I'd been given just made me sleep for almost 14 hours straight. And in that time, my friend had been in touch with the police to find out what kind of legal action I could actually take. But the sad fact was, unless I was tested right after I was brought into hospital, there was very little that could do to test my blood or urine. They needed my consent. And for that, they'd need to be able to wake me up. And thanks to whatever Jan had slipped into my tea was basically dead to the world until early the following morning. I could still make a complaint, and the police would have a word with Jan to make sure that she had nothing untoward to tell them about Andrew, or maybe even me for that matter. And then, this is the part that still gets me the most, when the police arrived to talk to Jen, guess who was there with her? Like nothing had ever happened? Yeah, Andrew. They confirmed that yes, there had been a bit of a tiff, and Andrew had been staying with his parents over the weekend. But nothing I'd said was true. In fact, according to them, I'd been a complete pain in the butt from the start to finish. And they have suspected of me being involved in a burglary that they'd been subjected to, because one of the things that have gone missing was, you guessed it, my laptop, the same laptop containing the only piece of evidence that anything remotely weird happened in the first place. I went ahead with the blood and urine test, just in case they'd pick anything up. But I had to wait weeks to get a negative result back. And by that time, I was living in an emergency accommodation provided by the university. The police said that that didn't mean that it wasn't drugged or spiked, as a lot of sedatives are out of your system. And I guess 12 hours or so. It just meant that I pretty much had no legal recourse, as it was now just a case of he said she said. My dad had driven over to help me get my stuff back. And funnily enough, Andrew hadn't been present during the exchange, and all my stuff was boxed up outside, so no actual contact had to be made. My dad had wanted to give Jen and Andrew a piece of his mind. But it's not surprising that they didn't fancy anything like that. I think by the time I had gotten my stuff back, I was just happy to have closed such a nightmarish chapter in my entire life. I totally resigned myself to police being no help whatsoever. I know it's not their fault. The fault lay in constraints in the law, so I just moved on and forgot about it ever happening. And I hope I never ran into them anywhere ever again. I try not to think about what would have happened if I'd given in and taken a nap that day, or if I hadn't caught on to what was going on. I could handle knowing Andrew was some kind of closeted pervert, but thinking his wife was in on it, and was about to sell me up the river for lying through her teeth for weeks. Like I said, after all that chaos and insanity, it just isn't worth thinking about. So back when I was in college here in Germany, me and a few friends of mine were invited to a house party one weekend. It wasn't sold as being I'm crazy all-night rave or anything like that. But since the drinking age is much lower than in the US, there had been a lot of beer. And it was starting to get pretty wild. In light of that, me and my friends were really excited. We knew that there were going to be girls, and being the young single guys that we knew that it'd be a great place to meet some potential dates and, do some flirting. We arrived stinking of cologne, wearing terrible button-up shirts with our beer in tow. And then we set up in the corner and just sort of awkwardly, were drinking amongst ourselves for a while. But then the more we drank, the more confident we got. And slowly but surely, we started to mingle. One of my friends started putting it on with a few different girls. And at first, it was fine to watch him struggle. He was our designated driver for the evening, meaning that he hadn't been drinking, was therefore still very nervous and pretty clumsy. But then, we saw that the attraction to one of the girls was very much reciprocated. We were happy for him. But as much as I'd like to tell you that we were mature and gave him some space, that wasn't the case at all. We kept harassing him and his potential date, playfully, of course, but it was still unwelcome. Eventually, he told us to leave them alone, because we were ruining his chances with her. And only then we finally respect his wishes, and just leave them in peace. We were pretty drunk by that period. So we just went off and entertained ourselves so he could get some space. Now a little time goes by and we start wondering where our sober friend and his lady are. We looked around everywhere for them, checking all of the bedrooms in the house. But all were occupied with people drinking or smoking, and our friend seemed to be nowhere to be seen. Then, in the process of looking for him, we found the girls' friends. And after asking where the new couple was, we discovered that they'd gone out to my friend's car for some alone time together. We knew exactly what they were up to. And although the girls' friends made us promise to leave them alone, we just had to get a picture for posterity, being immature and whatnot. You know the deal. I fully admit that our plan made us total a-holes, and that violating someone's intimate privacy is not only wrong, but also completely against the law, to be honest, and we didn't end up taking pictures or video of anyone that night, as you'll soon come to learn. In order to maintain the element of stealth, only one of us wouldn't creep up towards my friend's car before secretly recording whatever was going on inside. That was the plan, at least. And that person wasn't me. So the rest of us sort of held back at the party to make it look like we weren't doing exactly what it is we were doing. We talked to the girls' friends, kept them occupied trying and failing to flirt with them until we started to grow impatient. All our friend with the phone had to do was run up to the car, snap a few pictures, and then run back with this prize. But longer and longer went by, and there was no sign of her friend with the camera phone. Unable to wait any longer, I went outside to look for him. But instead of secretly filming our friend and his girl in the car, I found him sitting on the curb with no car in sight. He was on the phone with someone, so I figured shutting up and listening would get more answers than asking questions he wouldn't respond to. As I listened, I worked up the call was obviously a serious one. And by the end of it, I was almost certain that number one, he'd been crying. And number two, that the call sounded like he had been with the police. Asked them where our friend with the car was, and he just shook his head and told me we need to leave. When he looked up at me, it became clear that yes, he had been crying, but why? He didn't tell me until we took a taxi back to his apartment and over a few more beers and some cigarettes. He told me what happened. He tried to take some pictures as planned. But when he got to our friend's car, he found them in the passenger seat alone. His head was in his hands, and he was in this terrible state, with tears streaming down his face. My friend with the phone kept asking what happened with the girl over and over, but our friend with the car wouldn't say anything. Wouldn't or couldn't, I don't know. But my phone friend walks around to the passenger side to climb in and talk to him with some privacy. And he asks again, what happened with the girl, and our friend with the car just points the back seat. And that's when he realizes that our friend isn't alone in the car. He never was the under the blanket on the back seat. He recognized the shape of the person. It was the girl that he'd been with, and she wasn't breathing. But when my friend with the phone asked what had happened, car friend just kept saying, "I don't know. I don't know." At first, the maybe thought that the girl had had a seizure or maybe a freak heart failure, and he kept saying the call 112, which is the emergency number here in Germany for fire medical. My friend with the car, he wouldn't call. He kept saying things like, "Just wait a minute, I need to think in other things," to delay my other friend. My friend with the phone said that he jumped out of the car out of instinct, realizing that he was getting his DNA and all of those things onto what was now the scene of the crime, being very paranoid. There was no other reason why he would refuse to call the emergency number or tried to delay in any way, or why he'd covered her body instead of just running to get help, or maybe even trying to get her out. My friend with a phone then told the other to get out of his car, but he wouldn't. He just suddenly started the engine and drove off before my friend could stop him. He then was faced with a choice: run and get us, which is what he really wanted to do because he was completely freaked out, or do the right thing, be a man and just call the 110 number instead, which is not the number for medical, it's the number for the police. We later discovered that the friend with car had somehow suffocated this girl, although we never found out exactly how he planned to drive into the river man to take his own life and hide what he'd done. But he couldn't go through with it, and was found by the police and subsequently arrested. He pled guilty to everything to try and get as little time in prison as possible. And for a while it was a big story. But now for most people, it's half a forgotten memory really. When I recall it, to my mind always seemed to land on one specific thing my friend said when he was in his apartment afterwards. He said realizing that he sat in the car with a dead body as well as the killer themselves was the scariest feeling he'd ever felt, is the kind of moment that would top anybody's list of their life's scariest moments. But he said that just seconds later, he was faced with something that was somehow even more terrifying to him. He was terrified that one of the dead girl's friends was going to ask them where she was. And now he wouldn't be able to tell her. I just tried to be the best friend I could to him and get him away from the party before his worst fear came true. But I also understand how selfish it was of us not to warn anyone when it happened. Those girls might have carried on partying for a while, not knowing that one of their close friends was gone forever.